A young doctor saves the life of an ageist woman, and when she wakes up, she gets angry.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
St. Martin Hospital, located in the heart of the city, is known as a place of healing for thousands of patients every year. Here, Dr. Alexander Garcia has built a solid reputation despite being only in his early 30s. Respected by colleagues, adored by former patients, and viewed as a role model by young doctors, he specializes in internal surgery. No one, not even senior doctors with years of experience, can deny Alexander's exceptional skills. One Monday morning, as he was reviewing patient files, Alexander received a call from the head nurse. "Dr. Alexander, we've just admitted a very critical patient," Anna, the nurse, said over the phone. "Her name is Lucy Green, and her condition is quite severe. The hospital has assigned you as the lead surgeon." Alexander nodded quickly and rushed to the emergency room, accustomed to the intense pace of his work. Patient Lucy, a woman in her 60s, lay gasping for breath on the bed. Her cloudy eyes carried a sharp, distrustful gaze as they scanned the doctors and nurses around her. Beside Lucy stood her daughter, Carmen Green, a woman in her mid-30s with a worried face. "Will my mother be okay?" she asked as soon as Alexander entered the room. "We'll do everything we can," Alexander replied. "But she needs immediate surgery. Her cardiovascular condition is critical." Carmen held her mother's hand, whispering words of comfort. But Lucy, instead of expressing gratitude, turned to Alexander with a mistrustful glare. "You're my doctor. You're too young." "I don't like this," she said coldly. Alexander smiled, trying to reassure her. "Yes, I'll be handling your surgery. I've reviewed your medical records and believe the procedure will significantly improve your health." But Lucy wasn't easily convinced. "I don't trust you. Do you even have enough experience? I don't want someone under 30 cutting into my body. Why doesn't this hospital have someone else?" Carmen tried to interject. "Mom, he's the best doctor here. They chose him because he can save you." "I don't need to hear that. I want a doctor who's older and more experienced," Lucy shouted, unable to hide her anger. Despite her discomfort, the surgery had to proceed immediately, as Lucy's life was in danger. Alexander, undeterred by her complaints, focused solely on saving the patient's life. He understood that in this field, his emotions had to take a back seat to professionalism and decisiveness. The surgery lasted nearly 4 hours. During the procedure, Alexander demonstrated his mastery with every incision and decision, ensuring everything went smoothly. The surgical team worked seamlessly together, and in the end, Lucy's heart was revived. As Alexander stepped out of the operating room, he saw Carmen waiting with her younger brother, James, who had just arrived. James, a calm-looking man, still had worry etched on his face. "How is she, doctor?" James asked immediately. "She's out of danger." The surgery was successful, Alexander said in a calm yet confident tone. "I believe Lucy will recover well if she follows the prescribed treatment plan." Carmen burst into tears of relief. James exhaled deeply, his eyes lighting up with gratitude. "Thank you, doctor. You've saved our mother." Alexander nodded and offered a small smile. But deep down, he knew the surgery was only part of the battle. And he wasn't wrong. Lucy woke up the following afternoon. Instead of relief, her attitude worsened. As soon as she opened her eyes and saw Alexander checking her condition, she began to complain. "It's you," Lucy said angrily. "I'm in terrible pain. What did you do to me? Why am I not fully recovered yet?" "You just had surgery yesterday, Mrs. Lucy," Alexander said, keeping his tone calm. "This is a natural reaction after a major surgery. I'll adjust your pain medication to make you more comfortable. I don't need you explaining theory to me." Lucy snapped, turning away from Alexander. "You know nothing. If I die, it'll be your fault." Alexander pressed his lips together, refusing to let her harsh words affect him. But what happened next was the real challenge. During her recovery, Lucy continuously lodged unreasonable complaints about Dr. Alexander. She demanded to see hospital leadership and insisted on being assigned a different doctor. "He's too young, I can't trust him," Lucy said to Nurse Anna as she came to change her bandages. "I feel weaker every day. This is clearly his fault." The doctor's instructions were very clear, Mrs. Green, Anna tried to explain. "You're in the recovery phase, and these symptoms are normal after surgery. Don't defend him. I know when something's wrong with my body. They gave me an inexperienced doctor. I won't stand for this." One day, Carmen visited her mother after receiving a call from the hospital about Lucy's difficult attitude. When she entered the room, she saw Alexander standing there, trying to explain her mother's health condition, but all his efforts seemed futile. "Mom, I heard you've been complaining to the doctor. You know you need to cooperate with them to get better," Carmen said pleadingly. Lucy turned to her daughter, her eyes red with anger. "You don't understand, Carmen. He doesn't know what he's doing. I feel weaker every day." Alexander took a deep breath, restraining himself in the face of Lucy's unfair accusations. "Mrs. Lucy, I've done everything to ensure you're receiving the best care. Your health is progressing as expected, but if you have any concerns, I'm here to listen and make adjustments. I don't need your explanations," Lucy shouted. "I want another doctor, do you understand? Someone experienced, not a kid who's still wet behind the ears like you." Carmen stood there, torn between the two, unsure of how to handle the situation. She asked James to come and try to convince their mother to change her perspective. However, even when James explained that Alexander was the best person to help her recover, Lucy remained unmoved. Alexander left the room, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. Every criticism from Lucy felt like a direct blow to his pride, even though he knew he had done everything right. Alexander was no stranger to dealing with difficult patients, but Lucy Green seemed to be in a league of her own. Not only did she harbor resentment toward him from the start, but she also spread doubt about his skills and professionalism throughout the hospital. The next day, Alexander received a call from the hospital director, Dr. Roberto Castillo, a stern but experienced middle-aged man. "Alexander, I need you to come to my office immediately," Dr. Castillo's voice came over the phone, leaving no trace of sympathy. "We have an issue to discuss." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. He knew exactly what this was about but had to stay composed and face it head-on. When he entered the office, he saw Dr. Castillo sitting with Carmen and a lawyer who exuded authority seated beside her. "Good afternoon, Doctor," Carmen greeted him, her face slightly flushed with embarrassment. "My mother has requested a change of doctor, and we'd like to know how the hospital plans to address this." Alexander was stunned. While he had anticipated Lucy's reaction, the involvement of a lawyer was something he hadn't expected. Dr. Castillo looked at him with a mix of sympathy and tension. "Alexander, Mrs. Lucy Green has filed a formal request, not just to change doctors but also threatening to sue the hospital for medical negligence. But I followed every procedure. There was absolutely no mistake." Alexander couldn't contain his emotions. "Her surgery went perfectly, and her recovery is on track." "You're right," Lucy's lawyer, a middle-aged man in a sharp black suit, spoke up. "However, Mrs. Green claims her mental health has been severely impacted. She says the anxiety and insecurity caused by your perceived lack of experience are the primary reasons she isn't recovering as well as she could." Alexander couldn't believe what he was hearing. Lack of experience? "I've been an internal surgeon for 10 years and have performed hundreds of surgeries far more complex than this. These accusations are baseless." Carmen tried to intervene, her voice trembling as she sought to prevent further conflict. "Dr. Alexander, I know you've done your best, but my mother is very stubborn. You understand, don't you?" "Understand? Alexander said, his voice tinged with frustration. I can understand a patient's anxiety, but making false accusations and damaging my reputation is unacceptable. Dr. Castillo sighed and turned to Alexander. I know you did everything right, Alexander. But sometimes, we face things beyond our control. I'll review this case thoroughly, but for now, we must ensure the patient feels as comfortable as possible. Carmen, do you wish to proceed with your mother's request to change doctors? Carmen looked away, her voice barely audible. My mother won't change her mind. I don't think we have any other choice. Alexander stood there, a wave of anger and defeat washing over him. He had saved Lucy's life, but in return, she dismissed all his efforts and sought to tarnish his reputation and career. The next day, Lucy continued causing trouble at the hospital. She frequently complained about her pain, which only Dr. Alexander could effectively address, yet she refused to listen to any explanations from him. I don't want you touching me anymore. Lucy shouted as Alexander entered her room. I've requested a new doctor, and I won't let you near me again. Alexander kept his voice calm. Mrs. Lucy, I'm only here to check on your condition. I have no intention of forcing you to do anything you don't want to. But your situation requires close monitoring. Lucy glared at him with disdain. You can do whatever you want, but don't expect me to be grateful. I'll take you to court and make you pay for what you've done. Carmen, standing by the bedside, tried to mediate. Mom, please don't say that. The doctor is only trying to help you. I don't need his help. Lucy yelled, leaving Carmen stunned. If he's as good as everyone says, why am I still in so much pain? Alexander knew Lucy was deliberately twisting the truth to vent her frustrations, but the constant criticism wore him down. Each of her accusations felt like a blade cutting into his sense of honor. In the days that followed, Lucy became a thorn in the side of not just Alexander but the entire hospital staff. She made constant demands for attention, threatened lawsuits, and even intimidated hospital employees. One afternoon, as Alexander sat in the doctor's lounge, his colleague Dr. Marcos entered with a troubled expression. Alexander, listen. I know you're having a tough time with Mrs. Lucy, but this is beyond unfair. You don't deserve this. I know, Alexander replied, rubbing his forehead in exhaustion. I've done everything I can, but she still refuses to accept it. Did you know she called hospital management today and demanded they fire you? Dr. Marcos said, his eyes flashing with anger. This has gone too far. Alexander looked up, his frustration evident. She's really trying to destroy my career over her baseless prejudices about my age. Marcos placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder. Yes, but you can't let her words get to you. You're one of the best doctors here, and everyone knows it. But things only escalated. Lucy continued spreading negative comments about Alexander throughout her stay at the hospital. She even claimed he had made mistakes during her surgery, though there was no evidence to support her allegations. Alexander couldn't hide his frustration as he heard the baseless accusations from a patient he had worked so hard to save. Yet, he had no choice but to stay silent and focus on his work. Finally, after weeks of tension, Lucy was discharged. But instead of letting the matter rest, she hired a lawyer and officially sued Dr. Alexander and the hospital for medical malpractice. Alexander sat in his office, reading the lawsuit filed by Lucy. His hand clenched the paper tightly, but he could do nothing. He knew he had done everything correctly, yet the injustice he faced deeply wounded his pride. This wasn't just a lawsuit, it was an attack on the honor and career he had worked so hard to build. The trial between Lucy Green and Dr. Alexander Garcia began on a cold winter morning. News of the lawsuit spread quickly within the medical community, leaving many shocked and dismayed. No one at St. Martin Hospital could understand how a young, talented doctor like Alexander had been dragged into such an absurd case. Alexander entered the courtroom, his face tense but maintaining an air of calm composure. Beside him was his attorney, Manuel Torres, a middle-aged man renowned in the legal field for his sharp intellect and unwavering determination. Across the room, Lucy sat in her chair alongside her daughter Carmen and her lawyer, Ernesto Salazar, a tall, sharp man exuding confidence. Lucy no longer appeared weary as she had during her hospital stay. Instead, she sat upright, her eyes filled with pride and triumph. From the very start, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with tension. Ernesto stood, confidently stepping before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today to prove that my client, Mrs. Lucy Green, has endured undue suffering, not only physically but also mentally, due to the negligence and inexperience of Dr. Alexander Garcia." Alexander frowned. Ernesto's words felt like daggers piercing his pride. How could he distort the truth so completely? "My client, a woman in her 60s, entered the hospital trusting that she would receive care from skilled professionals. Instead, she was subjected to the care of a doctor who was too young, inexperienced, and incapable of performing such a critical surgery. We will demonstrate that Dr. Garcia violated medical standards, resulting in prolonged pain and a decline in Mrs. Green's health." Alexander could clearly feel the indignation in Ernesto's tone, but what angered him more was Lucy's silence. She sat there, looking at him with a calm, almost indifferent expression, devoid of any gratitude or empathy. Manuel, Alexander's attorney, rose to present his counterargument. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Alexander Garcia is a highly skilled surgeon who has performed hundreds of successful surgeries. We will show that Mrs. Lucy Green's operation was carried out entirely according to protocol and that no errors were made. Her allegations are baseless and driven by personal emotions rather than facts." The trial began with Lucy's testimony. Ernesto approached her, carefully framing his questions to guide the jury toward his desired conclusion. "Mrs. Green, can you describe how you felt after the surgery?" Ernesto asked, his tone gentle but firm. Lucy sighed, her expression pained. "From the moment I woke up, I was in unbearable pain. Each passing day, I felt weaker. I couldn't believe they entrusted my life to a young, inexperienced doctor." Ernesto nodded, appearing to empathize with her ordeal. "Did you feel reassured under Dr. Garcia's care?" "Absolutely not," Lucy said loudly, capturing the attention of everyone in the courtroom. "From the beginning, I didn't trust him. He was too young, and I couldn't believe someone like him could handle such a complicated surgery." Carmen, sitting beside her mother, looked visibly uncomfortable. It was clear she didn't entirely agree with her mother's words, but familial loyalty kept her silent. Manuel then rose for his cross-examination. "Mrs. Green, you've stated that you felt pain and didn't recover properly after surgery. Do you have any evidence that Dr. Garcia deviated from standard procedures? Is there any medical report indicating that he made a mistake?" Lucy hesitated, her eyes shifting. I don't have a specific medical report, but I know my body. I know something wasn't right after the surgery." Manuel pressed on, giving her no room to pause. "So, you are basing your claim on personal feelings, not on concrete evidence, correct? You have no specific proof to support your allegations?" Lucy bit her lip, clearly feeling cornered. But Ernesto quickly interjected, redirecting the jury's attention. "A patient's feelings are a crucial aspect of their treatment. A doctor is not only responsible for physical healing but also for providing reassurance to their patients. Clearly, Dr. Garcia failed in this regard." Alexander sat there, feeling a wave of helplessness wash over him. Not only did he have to defend himself against baseless accusations, but he also had to navigate a complex legal system where a patient's emotions could be used as evidence to tarnish his reputation. After Lucy's testimony, Carmen was called to the stand as a witness. It was clear she didn't want to be there, but as her mother's daughter, she couldn't refuse the request. Manuel approached, ready to ask his questions. "Carmen, I know you love your mother and want the best for her. But can you answer a few questions honestly?" Manuel asked calmly. Carmen nodded, her eyes betraying her nervousness. During the time Mrs. Lucy was hospitalized, did you witness any actions by Dr. Garcia that would suggest he didn't fulfill his responsibilities? Carmen hesitated, then shook her head. No, I didn't witness anything like that. Dr. Garcia was always dedicated and professional. I have no reason to doubt him. Manuel continued, his gaze shifting toward the jury. Then can you explain why your mother distrusted Dr. Garcia from the very beginning? Carmen sighed, visibly uncomfortable. My mother has certain biases against younger people. She has always believed that only older individuals have the necessary experience to handle important tasks like this. Her words gave Alexander a slight sense of relief. At least she wasn't siding with her mother in these baseless accusations. But he knew this might not be enough to extricate him from the chaos Lucy had created. Ernesto immediately stood to cross-examine. Carmen, you said Dr. Garcia was very professional, but didn't you also notice that your mother didn't recover as quickly as expected, correct? Carmen hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yes, my mother didn't recover as quickly as we hoped. But that doesn't mean it was the doctor's fault. Alexander felt a glimmer of hope hearing her response, but Ernesto pressed further. It might not be the doctor's direct fault, but could it be possible that a patient's feelings of insecurity and a lack of recovery could result from shortcomings in the treatment process? Carmen didn't know how to respond, and her hesitation only added to Alexander's growing tension. The truth was, even the slightest pause in a witness's words could become a weapon for Ernesto to use against Alexander. Alexander sat quietly, listening to the back and forth between his lawyer and Ernesto. Earlier, he had felt waves of indignation at being dragged into such a ridiculous lawsuit. But by this point, his anger had matured into something deeper. He no longer saw this as a fair trial but rather as a staged performance by Lucy and Ernesto to cast him as the villain. The more he listened, the more the injustice filled the courtroom like a heavy fog. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Ernesto continued, his voice hammering into everyone's ears like a relentless drumbeat. Mrs. Lucy Green endured not only physical pain but also severe emotional distress. Her inability to feel secure, her lack of trust in a less experienced doctor, directly hindered her recovery process. A patient cannot recover swiftly if they do not trust their caregiver. Alexander could no longer hold back. He turned to Manuel, frustration etched across his face. This is too much. They're turning me into a failure based solely on her emotions. There's no evidence that I did anything wrong, yet they keep fixating on her feelings to attack me. Manuel placed a reassuring hand on Alexander's shoulder. I know, but we must follow the legal process. Don't let your anger cloud your judgment. Still, the need to restrain himself only deepened Alexander's sense of helplessness. At that moment, Ernesto stood and called a new witness to the stand. It was a doctor from the hospital's surgical team, Dr. Lorena Ramirez, who had worked alongside Alexander during Lucy's surgery. Lorena stepped up to the witness stand with confidence. Ernesto began the questioning. Dr. Ramirez, did you work with Dr. Garcia during Mrs. Lucy's surgery? Yes, Lorena replied, her tone serious. Then, can you tell the jury your impression of Dr. Garcia during the surgery? Ernesto asked, his tone clear, as if implying something was amiss. Lorena glanced briefly at Alexander before answering. Dr. Garcia is a talented physician. He performed the surgery with precision and professionalism. Alexander breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that someone was finally standing up for him. But Ernesto didn't miss the opportunity to press further. Then do you think there's anything that might have caused Mrs. Lucy to feel uneasy about Dr. Garcia's skills? Ernesto asked in a suggestive tone. Lorena hesitated briefly before replying. Perhaps Mrs. Lucy felt uneasy because Dr. Garcia is young. Maybe she wasn't accustomed to having such a young doctor perform her surgery. Alexander felt a punch to his chest. That's not what this is about, he wanted to shout, but he had to remain silent. Everything seemed to boil down to prejudice against his age, and no one here had the courage to stand up and affirm that he had done his job well. Manuel rose to object, but Ernesto had succeeded in planting more doubt in the jury's minds. Now it was Dr. Alexander's turn to take the stand. He stepped up, his eyes filled with suppressed disappointment and anger. Manuel started with gentle questions, helping him explain the details of Lucy's surgery. "Dr. Garcia, can you describe Mrs. Lucy Green's surgery?" Manuel asked. Alexander nodded. The surgery was conducted according to protocol, with no complications. I took all necessary steps to ensure Mrs. Lucy's safety and recovery. After the surgery, I monitored her daily to track her recovery progress. Manuel continued. "Have you ever felt that you made a mistake or failed in your responsibilities toward Mrs. Lucy?" "Absolutely not." Alexander responded, his voice filled with determination. "I followed all medical procedures correctly, and there were no errors in her treatment." However, when Ernesto rose and began his cross-examination, he quickly honed in on Alexander's age, a point that clearly resonated with the jury. "Dr. Garcia, you said you've performed hundreds of surgeries before, but Mrs. Lucy stated that she felt unsafe because you're too young. Do you think your youth and lack of experience could have caused her unease?" Alexander tried to stay calm. "I have undergone extensive training and have sufficient experience to perform this surgery. My age does not affect my ability to do my job." Ernesto smiled faintly, as if he had achieved his goal. "But, doctor, a patient's feelings are important, aren't they? If Mrs. Lucy didn't feel safe, could it be due to a lack of confidence in your skills?" Alexander gritted his teeth, feeling cornered. "The patient's feelings are important, but they are not evidence that I did anything wrong." "So, you admit that Mrs. Lucy's feelings are part of the issue, don't you?" Ernesto pressed relentlessly. Alexander wanted to rebut, but he knew that anything he said could be twisted. Ernesto had turned personal feelings into a weapon against him, even though his work had been flawless. When the first day of the trial ended, Alexander walked out with an unshakable anger. He had devoted his career to saving lives, and now, because of one woman's inability to acknowledge the truth, he was being smeared and labeled as irresponsible. The feeling of betrayal and helplessness weighed heavily on him. Manuel approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We still have a chance tomorrow, but I understand how you feel. This is unfair." Alexander nodded, but deep inside, this injustice had already left a wound that would not easily heal. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the courtroom with a heavy heart. The criticisms and unreasonable prejudices of Lucy echoed in his mind all night. He couldn't understand how someone he had saved could treat him so unfairly. Everything he had done was for her safety and recovery, yet all he received in return were doubts and accusations. Manuel turned to Alexander and said, "Now, I want to call an important witness to shed light on the truth. Mrs. Anna, the head nurse of the hospital, who directly cared for Mrs. Lucy during her recovery." Anna stepped up to the stand with confidence and professionalism. She was a seasoned nurse who had been with St. Martin Hospital for over 20 years. In those years, she had worked with many doctors and understood their work styles intimately. Manuel began the questioning. "Mrs. Anna, can you tell us about the care Mrs. Lucy received after her surgery?" Anna nodded, her voice calm but resolute. "I directly cared for Mrs. Lucy from the first day after her surgery. I can affirm that Dr. Garcia did everything possible to ensure her smooth recovery. He not only checked on her daily but also listened attentively to her concerns and questions." Manuel smiled faintly and continued. "Did you notice any mistakes in Dr. Garcia's treatment of Mrs. Lucy?" "None at all," Anna replied. "In fact, Dr. Garcia's surgery was a success. Mrs. Lucy survived a critical condition, and her health recovered as expected. Her complaints were not based on any evidence of medical error but merely her personal feelings." Alexander sat there, looking at Anna with a glimmer of hope. Her testimony was a ray of light amidst the storm of baseless accusations. But he knew it would take more than this to turn the tide. When Anna stepped down, Manuel rose. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there is something crucial to remember. Dr. Garcia is not only a talented surgeon but also someone who has saved countless lives in nearly hopeless situations. To prove this, we would like to call a special witness, someone who was once in a critical condition but, thanks to Dr. Garcia, was able to survive and overcome her ordeal. Manuel turned to the courtroom door and signaled for someone to enter. From the doorway, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her hair, dressed in a simple blouse, stepped in. Her gaze was warm and filled with gratitude as it rested on Alexander. It was Mrs. Julia Fernandez, a former patient of Alexander's who had faced a complex brain tumor that other doctors had refused to operate on. Manuel continued. "Mrs. Julia, could you share with us your experience of being treated by Dr. Garcia?" Julia nodded, her eyes lighting up as she recalled her story. "I remember it as if it were yesterday. I had been to many hospitals and seen many doctors, but they all said I couldn't be saved because the tumor in my brain was too dangerous to operate on. I was ready to face death until I met Dr. Garcia." She paused briefly, glancing at Alexander with an indescribable sense of gratitude. "He not only agreed to perform the surgery but also took the time to explain every risk to me. He didn't make any false promises, but he achieved the impossible. Dr. Garcia saved my life." Manuel turned to the jury. "Mrs. Julia, did you feel worried knowing that Dr. Garcia would be performing your surgery?" Julia shook her head firmly. "No. In fact, I had complete trust in him from the start. He was always calm, explained everything clearly, and made me feel at ease. I trusted that I was in the hands of an excellent doctor." Ernesto, visibly uncomfortable, stepped forward to counter. "Mrs. Julia, you say that Dr. Garcia saved your life, but your surgery and Mrs. Lucy's surgery were very different, weren't they? You can't claim that your trust in him applies to every other patient, can you?" Julia looked at Ernesto with a sharp gaze. "I'm not a doctor, but I know one thing, Dr. Garcia saved me when no one else dared to. If Mrs. Lucy felt uneasy, it's because she didn't truly know him. But that doesn't mean he's not capable." Manuel smiled, sensing a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the courtroom. Julia had brought warmth and an undeniable truth. Alexander wasn't just a skilled doctor, he was also a dedicated and courageous one. However, Manuel knew they needed more. "Ladies and gentlemen," Manuel continued. "We have one more witness, another individual who once stood on the brink of death but, thanks to Dr. Garcia, can stand here today to share their story." The courtroom doors opened again, and this time, a middle-aged man, limping slightly with the aid of a cane, entered. It was Mr. Enrique Delgado, who had suffered a severe car accident and had been told he would not fully recover without Alexander's timely intervention. Enrique Delgado entered the courtroom, his steps slow but steady, his eyes reflecting determination. All eyes turned to him, and the jury seemed captivated by the presence of a man bearing the marks of time and a harrowing accident. Manuel Torres, Alexander's lawyer, smiled confidently as Enrique took the witness stand. He began his questioning in a gentle yet pointed tone. "Mr. Enrique, can you tell us about your condition before meeting Dr. Alexander Garcia?" Enrique looked toward Alexander, his gaze filled with gratitude before he replied. "I was in a car accident 2 years ago. I was brought to the hospital in critical condition, with multiple severe injuries, including spinal damage. The initial doctors all said I might never walk again." The courtroom fell silent. Enrique's words cut through the air, creating an undeniable tension. Manuel continued. "And then you met Dr. Garcia, correct? Can you tell us what he did to help you?" Enrique nodded, his voice trembling slightly as he recounted his story. "I remember that day clearly. Dr. Garcia came to see me with a look of determination in his eyes. He told me there was a chance, a slim one, that I might walk again. But the surgery would be extremely complicated and risky. Still, he didn't back down. He said that if I was willing to fight, he would do everything in his power to help me recover. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before continuing. And true to his word, Dr. Garcia operated on me. Thanks to him, I can stand here today. Though I still need this cane to walk, that doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm alive and able to continue my life, all because of Dr. Garcia. The jury couldn't help but be moved by Enrique's story. Some even glanced at Alexander with sympathetic eyes. Sitting in the back, Alexander felt a small wave of relief. Enrique's testimony was a powerful testament that he wasn't just a skilled doctor but also a courageous and steadfast one. Ernesto Salazar, Lucy's lawyer, worked to maintain his composure as he stepped forward to cross-examine Enrique. Mr. Delgado, I don't deny that Dr. Garcia helped you, but do you think other patients might not feel the same trust and safety you experienced? Enrique shook his head, his gaze turning sharp. I am not someone who trusts easily. But Dr. Garcia showed me his dedication and professionalism. If someone doesn't trust him, that's their problem, not the doctor's. Enrique's powerful words left the room in silence. Manuel continued questioning, emphasizing Alexander's dedication to all his patients. After Enrique left the witness stand, Manuel stood up, turning to the jury for his closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, today we've heard the stories of individuals whose lives were saved by Dr. Garcia, people who are here today because of his skill and dedication. There is no evidence to suggest that Dr. Garcia made any mistakes during Mrs. Lucy's surgery. Accusations based on personal feelings cannot be the foundation to tarnish the reputation of a doctor who has saved countless lives. Alexander sat quietly, feeling a slight sense of relief. He had done everything he could. Now, everything was in the jury's hands. Finally, after a tense deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The jury foreman stood up, holding the verdict. We, the jury, having reviewed all the evidence, conclude that Dr. Alexander Garcia performed Mrs. Lucy Green's surgery in accordance with proper procedure and made no errors in her care. We declare this case dismissed. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. Justice had been served. Lucy, sitting next to her daughter, was visibly furious but could do nothing more. Carmen hung her head, speechless, while James, her younger brother, gripped her shoulder, trying to console her. Alexander stood up and looked toward Manuel with gratitude. Manuel patted his shoulder, a faint smile on his face. Congratulations, Alexander. You deserved this vindication. Alexander felt as if the heavy burden he had been carrying had finally been lifted. The accusations, the prejudice, everything was now behind him. He could return to his work, saving lives. This is just one step in a long journey, Alexander thought to himself. But now, he knew he could stand stronger than ever. Standing outside the courtroom, the afternoon sun gently illuminated his face. The sky was clear and blue, but his heart still felt unsettled. The trial was over, the truth had been revealed, and he had won. But the victory wasn't entirely sweet. Instead, it left Alexander with a deeper lesson about life, people, and how society measures competence. Manuel walked out of the courtroom, looking at Alexander with a kind smile. You did well, Alexander. You maintained your resolve and professionalism through it all. Alexander nodded but remained thoughtful. Thank you, Manuel. But I can't help thinking about everything that happened. Lucy isn't the only one who looks at me and sees just my age, not what I've done. Manuel studied Alexander intently before speaking. You know, age is just a number. But many people in this society are stuck in the mindset that youth equals inexperience, while older individuals are automatically respected. The important thing is that you've proven the opposite. It's your dedication and skill that have saved so many lives, and that doesn't depend on the number of years you've lived. Alexander sighed. I've done everything I could, but just because I'm young, people like Lucy dismiss my abilities. I wonder how many others out there are facing the same prejudice, just because they don't seem experienced enough to others. Manuel smiled gently. The issue isn't age, it's the mindset of others. You might be the youngest in the room, but that doesn't diminish the value of what you've learned and achieved. As you've seen from the witnesses today, none of them cared about your age. What mattered to them was that you saved their lives. Alexander looked up at the sky, reflecting on Manuel's words. He thought about the patients who had testified during the trial, people like Julia and Enrique. They never asked about his age when their lives were on the line, and that made Alexander realize that true value lies in skill and dedication, not in appearances or years of experience. The next day, Alexander returned to the hospital. He felt an unusual sense of peace as he walked through the halls where he had once rushed with worry and stress. Lucy's accusations had been dismissed, and now he could continue his work with a lighter heart. While checking on a new patient's condition, Alexander received a call from Carmen, Lucy's daughter. Dr. Alexander, I just wanted to apologize, Carmen said, her voice trembling. My mother, she shouldn't have treated you that way. I know you did your best to help her, but she just didn't understand that. Alexander hesitated for a moment before replying. Carmen, I'm not angry with her. I understand that during illness, emotions can often take over. What matters is that everything has been clarified, and I hope Mrs. Lucy recovers well. Carmen sighed, sensing the forgiveness in Alexander's words. You're truly an amazing doctor, not just because of your skills, but because of your heart. I hope one day my mother will see that. After the call ended, Alexander stood silently for a moment. He knew that forgiveness and compassion were also part of being a doctor. Not everyone could immediately recognize a person's abilities beyond appearances, and that sometimes led to painful misunderstandings. That evening, in his office, Alexander sat thoughtfully at his desk. He recalled his early years in medicine, filled with passion and enthusiasm but also burdened by criticism about being too young to achieve greatness. Yet with every surgery, every patient saved, he had proven to everyone that talent was not bound by age. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. In each beat, he felt the strength of determination, patience, and belief in himself. The challenges he had just faced were only part of a long journey, and he knew there were many others who would confront the same prejudices he had. Age is just a number, Alexander whispered to himself, as if reminding his own heart. It's ability and dedication that define a person's worth. That day, Alexander not only won a legal battle but also triumphed over the prejudice of age. He had proven that youth did not equate to incompetence and that age was never an accurate measure of talent. More importantly, he knew that his efforts would always serve as the strongest answer to any bias he might encounter. As a new day began, Alexander resolved, talent doesn't wait for age. I will continue on this path, undeterred by prejudice, because I know I can make a difference. The story teaches that perseverance and skill can overcome prejudice, as shown by Dr. Alexander Garcia's unwavering dedication despite Lucy Green's unfounded accusations. While Lucy judged Alexander based on his age, his professionalism and past successes, supported by patients like Julia Fernandez and Enrique Delgado, proved his worth. Carmen's eventual apology highlights the importance of understanding and admitting biases. This story underscores that true competence is measured by actions and results, not by superficial judgments. Alexander's journey reminds us that resilience and compassion are vital in combating stereotypes.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.